Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to say that twice over, given the context that it got a little hairy out there in the last couple of hours. So really appreciate everyone coming out on this otherwise little dreary evening. It feels, in a weird way, somewhat appropriate. The topic that we're approaching tonight can be a little dreary, I think, at times in the modern context, but I hope we have a great conversation and find a little optimism about the future of journalism in Canada and the future of the information ecosystem that all of us rely on as citizens. So my name is Brendan Stephen. I'm a director with Catholic Conscience. Very quickly about Catholic Conscience, for those who don't know the organization, really our purpose, what we do and the work that we do, is to try and form Catholic citizens here in Canada in the teachings of the church and in our gospel values, and then send them out into the world and escort them on that journey as they get engaged in our politics and get engaged in our civil society. So really we're a Catholic civic engagement organization. This event is a part of a series of events that we're doing here at the Newman Centre in the lead up to this year's federal election, touching on a variety of topics that are going to be really relevant for Catholic activists and Catholic voters in the lead up to October. So today we're talking about news. The event that's happening on May 31st, Matthew, am I correct? May 31st? May 30th, thank you. May 30th is about participation in political parties. So we'll have representatives from the major Canadian political parties, the Liberals, the Conservatives, the New Democrats, and the Greens, to tell you a little bit more about how you can get involved with their parties, some of their parties' stances on issues that are of interest to us as Catholics. And so we hope we come out for that. And before I start, a big thank you to our friends at the Newman Centre. Can we give them a round of applause for having us here today? They've just been wonderful partners, and for those who know the work of Newman, how important their work is here on campus, on other campuses, working with Catholic students. So it's just a great privilege to be here. So I'm going to stop talking now because I'm not the reason you're here. We've brought together this really incredible panel of people, current journalists, former journalists, academics, people who work in the communications ecosystem, to talk a little bit more about how we as Catholics can follow our gospel call to discern truth and to seek truth in a very polarized information age. So I'll just give brief introductions, and I think I'll start over here with Michael. This is Michael Swan, everyone. Michael is Associate Editor of the Catholic Register newspaper, a newspaper I hope you are all subscribed to. Here we are at the Newman Centre, which has nationwide circulation in Canada. He spent a 20-year career in Catholic print media, reporting on a wide variety of topics, particularly issues pertaining to social justice and the social teachings of the Catholic Church. And he has spent time at the Oshawa Times and was professor of the English language at the Southwest Agricultural University at Bebe Sichuan. Am I saying that correctly? Bebe Sichuan, there we go. So, ladies and gentlemen, Michael Swan. To my left, we have Mark Brosens. So Mark is currently the communications manager at the Archdiocese of Toronto. Particularly, he focuses on work with the Ontario and Canadian governments. Prior to joining the Archdiocese, Mark spent more than 10 years as a journalist and producer at TV Ontario, at the finest current affairs program this country has available, The Agenda with Steve Pagan. I have to plug Steve. He also spent some time in politics, so Mark will bring that perspective as well. We are joined by Daniel, Daniel Torchia. So Daniel's a wonderful addition, was not actually on the original program, but Daniel is Managing Director and Partner at Torchia Communications? Torchia, I apologize, Torchia Communications. He's a public relations consultant who helps organizations integrate sound strategies into their corporate management and marketing functions. So Daniel brings the perspective of a PR strategist, so the perspective of, others other than journalists and readers who participate in the information landscape. And I'm going to steal a quote you put on LinkedIn because I liked it so much. Daniel says, PR helps nurture dialogue and equitable relationships between organizations and their stakeholder groups. I think that's a concept we'll explore a little more tonight. And last but certainly not least, especially on the educational attainment side of the question, Professor Reid B. Locklin, down at the end here, is associate professor of Christianity and the intellectual tradition in the Department for the Study of Religion of the University of Toronto and the University of St. Michael's College. His research focuses on issues in comparative theology and Hindu-Christian studies, particularly engagement between Christian thought and the Hindu tradition of, here I go, Advaita Vedanta. Thank you very much. And Professor Locklin also writes on the scholarship of teaching and learning in theology and religion. Dr. Locklin grew up in Athens, Georgia, completed the BA in Humanities at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, an MTS at Boston University, a PhD in theology at Boston College in 2003, and he's been at U of T since 2004. So please give our whole panel a warm welcome. So I want to open our discussion, kind of set the table a little bit as we begin this. I'm struck we're having this conversation not too long after the PR firm Edelman put out their annual Trust Barometer. So for those who don't know the Trust Barometer, this is a study that Edelman's been doing for 10 plus years now, basically looking at the trust between Canadians and those in other countries and their institutions, whether it's the media, whether it's their government, medicine, science, things like that. This year's showed some really interesting information about Canadians' trust, particularly in journalists. So we're seeing this interesting trend where Canada is starting to catch up to the rest of the world's distrust in institutions. So where Canada historically had been this interesting bastion of trust within institutions, this year we're starting to see that distrust start to grow. And there's a particular gap that's very interesting. So there's a growing gap between the informed public and their trust in institutions. So those who read lots of media during the week, read lots of news, and the larger mass public is what the study calls it. So those who do not regularly absorb news. So that mass public is seeing a massive increase in their distrust, while that informed public has been pretty steady in terms of their trust in institutions. So the question of how we absorb information as democratic citizens, I think, has never been more important to the success of our country and our future. So I want to go to the panel and start by everyone sort of, I would love if the whole panel could contextualize for a moment what you think the primary contemporary challenges of all these challenges between facing the relationship between news consumers and journalism. So I think we'll start with our journalist, Michael.
Okay. Yeah. I think in many ways the challenges we face are the challenges we've always faced, in that people fail to put news into a broader context. When I was an editor on little daily newspapers around Ontario, the Guelph Mercury and the Oshawa Times and so on, people would say to me, well, it's all bad news, it's all terrible. You guys just are, read a book, go to a movie. The news is the news. It shouldn't rule your life. It shouldn't determine everything. And the news makes more sense if you can see it in the context of your family, of your community, of your of the rest of the media you consume. If you just read the news, maybe it does look rather dark and grim and terrible. That's not your life. Remember your life. Remember the people you love, the world you live in. And then the news will make more sense.
So do you think then, to follow on your point, part of the challenge we face is we as news consumers expect the news to emotionally make us feel good. That's right. Emotionally justify us.
Not only do people want the news to emotionally justify them, they want it to ratify their own feelings. They want their own instincts. Actually, news is about contravening your instincts. Everybody in the world wakes up in the morning with a picture of the world in their head. It's probably not accurate, but it's very universal. You've got this picture of what the world is like. And the newspaper in the morning, back in the days when I started this, would come up each day and say, here's the exceptions to that picture you have in your mind. So if you imagined that the Twin Towers in New York were standing, that was part of your picture of the world, and you woke up one day and they weren't standing anymore. That's news. Now, it's not a nice thing, it's not happy news, but it's different from your picture of the world. And what we're doing is updating your picture of the world. Okay? It doesn't have the purpose of ratifying things you already know. It has the purpose of telling you what you don't yet know.
So Michael's talking about validation as a primary challenge, and we expect news to validate us. Mark, what do you think is really the primary challenge we face in this context?
We'll get better at this as the night goes on. So the Dutch have an expression which I think is actually really helpful when it comes to this issue of trust in journalism, and I'm not going to try to speak Dutch to you. However, it's something along the lines of translation of cheaply bought is expensively bought. Cheap is expensive. And so I think this is really important when it comes to journalism right now, because I think there is a fundamental issue about trust in journalism right now in the public's mind. I think over the course of several decades, I think the public have come to distrust journalists for a lot of reasons that are sometimes the fault of journalists and sometimes not the fault of journalists. To a certain extent, I think people have a negativity bias in their psychology. So if they get a paper and everything is true and accurate and right in there, you don't think about that. That was just the news. But then if you get the paper and you read it and you take in all this information, and it turns out something in there was wrong. Like, let's say we invaded a country because of information that turned out to not be true in the end. People get really upset about that, and they remember that, and that sinks into their head, and that makes them not want to trust the media in the way that they did before. And then that gets them to not want to subscribe to a newspaper. And then that gets them to not want to listen to the news. And that creates a snowball effect where all of a sudden you have financial troubles in newsrooms. In The Walrus, just the most recent edition, April Lindgren, who is a professor of journalism at Ryerson University, she had a really interesting article where she went through the practical cuts that have happened to newsrooms across Ontario because they don't have the money anymore. So you look at the situation like, okay, the Ottawa Citizen. In the 90s, they had 190 journalists creating news. Today, like as of this month, they had 50. So you got to think, well, there's 4 times fewer people in a newsroom, there's going to be more mistakes. And what they're going to be able to cover is going to be substantially less substantial. And this kind of created, to a certain extent in my mind, kind of a bit of a death spiral when it comes to media in this country. I don't want to be terribly negative, but like, let's put it on the table. At a certain point, we stopped trusting the media, and as a result, we stopped consuming it, which then created a situation where it was harder for journalists to produce news that was worthwhile, which then, with the advent of social media and the internet, let us go outside of the traditional media and start getting media from elsewhere. Now, the problem is a lot of that media that we get from elsewhere on social media and the internet is junk. And so we got upset, I think, at a certain point with journalists for mistakes that they made. And as a result, we went to people who had less credibility to make that journalism happen. Because journalism is really hard to do. So I think that, to a certain extent, yes, there's a trust issue. Yes, journalists have created this problem themselves to a certain extent because their job is really hard and they haven't done it the best they could sometimes. But what I worry about is, in our current context, have we cut off our nose to spite our face?
I'm glad you've brought the conversation there because I think, Daniel, this is really an excellent part for you to come in, because you have worked so often with organizations who represent those, let's call them growing others in the information ecosystem. And I think you touched on this, Mark, the idea that it used to be a very direct line between journalism, produced news, Canadians, citizens everywhere consumed news. But now those sources have become so much more diverse, whether found online or offline. And to your point, Mark, the quality of the truth-telling of those sources can come into question. So, not that any of the organizations that you work with do that, but but I guess from the perspective of someone who works in this space, of the other participants, are you seeing this trend? What do you see as the primary challenge?
Wow, I'm an optimist. I keep a good attitude, but I see a big underbelly of corporate Canada and corporate America, which is awfully ugly. Selfishness, greed. We work with for-profit organizations and others that desperately want to control the narrative, that desperately want to put out information, to put a veneer or tell a story which is contrived, strategic for their self-interest. And so I see the worst of corporate Canada and America. So I've wanted to run away many times, but as a kid I always wanted to be a missionary. We need more ethical, sincere, loving people in major corporations. The biggest issue that I see or challenge between consumers and journalism, I think, is one. There's 4 or 5 points, but my first one is different worldviews. When I studied PR, public relations, which is the right, like, ethical, two-way, harmony-based public relations, in other words, an organization that lives in harmony with its environment, that's the definition of PR, an organization that communicates with compromise, with dialogue, to sustain itself, to have sustainability. They talked about worldview. So I think the issue I find is that nowadays, with such fragmentation of media, which is good, and the democratization of media, we're sitting together, but we have different worldviews in our city. So I've met someone who's justified to me why honor killing is right. And we had a good, not good, but we had a respectful conversation, but from completely different worldviews. I always say when I leave my street, the person next to me is plugged into Portuguese television. This one's on Al Jazeera. That one's on Helleni, Greek TV. This one's on Telemundo, Univision. And this one is still lingering to CBC, Hockey Night in Canada. It's like everybody's different, which is fine. But therefore, are we, the next point, challenge, so worldview is one challenge. The next one is education. I don't know if we're educating, I actually know, I have kids. Are we educating our kids in the game of life in this new reality? I think the answer is lamentable. So basically, are we teaching our kids about worldview? Are we teaching our kids about Telemundo versus Al Jazeera versus this left-leaning, right-leaning? Are we educating them in this new reality? And including reduced newsrooms, journalism, citizen journalism. And I think the other thing is broken families and enslavement to make a buck. So broken families, how are you supposed to have time to consume the news in a mature way if you're putting on the TV to keep the kids quiet while you make dinner because someone's working, 2 people are working, or it's a broken relationship? It's very understandable. But broken relationships and enslavement to make ends meet doesn't leave much room. And somehow I think that, my parents are from Egypt. We know in Egypt people know about slavery to make pyramids, slavery, and I think we're all slaves in a certain way. I won't get killed probably tonight or tomorrow, but I am a slave to make the payments. And I think we need to find ways to get out of that slavery. So those are 3 points. We can go on, but it's serious issues at stake here.
That's wonderful, and I want to. I want to draw the thread for a second between what Michael was talking about, the expectation of emotional validation, and 2 points you touched on. First of all, the role of worldview and what we expect from news. But I love that, tying that into this wider issue of, and the church talks about this all the time, we approach so much of our culture as consumers. And part of the consumer mindset is we expect what we buy to work for us, right? And are we approaching news that way? Where, to this, again, to your emotional validation point, I want what I'm buying to tell me the things that I would like and the things I want to hear. And this is a nice bridge to Reid, because I think everyone got our Beatitudes of News when they first came in. Reid wrote, this is a lightly amended version of the one that Reid wrote, which is, "Blessed are those who distinguish between a news source's ideological bias and its commitment to fact-based reporting. They shall read their news sources wisely." So on this topic of approaching news as consumers and worldview being part of that consumption decision, I think all of us kind of get this idea that ideological bias is a barrier to truth, but can you take that idea a little deeper for us? Why does ideological bias serve as such a barrier to seeking truth?
So I'm going to answer that unexpectedly. I'm not sure that it does if we distinguish it from fact-based reporting. The problem is when we get confused. So I should say that I'm here primarily as a reader of news. So I study 8th century texts in India. So everything we're talking about, from the 9th century is news, right? And it's interesting. I mean, like I was thinking about what Daniel was saying. I'm pretty convinced that in Kerala in the 8th century there were multiple worldviews, but there was also some common reference points in terms of media. They were stone. They were in the city. They were temple structures. When I was a kid, and I'm actually going to answer your question, when I was a kid I had a newspaper route. And so the common reference points weren't in stone, they weren't in the town, they were in a paper called the Centre Daily Times that every house got. And they were in news reports from only 3 networks that were pretty incestuous in and of themselves. So they often had the same stories. And what that meant was that I think there were lots of different worldviews even then. Lots of different worldviews, but some common reference points. Right? So whether you agreed or didn't agree, everybody had that paper and they could refer across it. And so I think that the reason that ideology has become a problem is not because ideology is always a problem, but because now we're choosing our news sources. And so we're looking for some basis to choose them. Like the people in my hometown chose their news source primarily by geography. They happened to live in that town. Now, because we have access to so many news sources, we're looking for news sources. And then I think that oftentimes what we're looking for is an unbiased news source. And I would say that unbiased news sources don't exist. Instead, we should be looking for a news source whose bias we acknowledge that is committed to fact-based reporting. So let me just give an example. In 2011, I was living in the US. I'm from the US, obviously. But I was living there, I was on sabbatical, and I was listening to National Public Radio, which is a publicly supported radio program. And I was listening to their news program, and they were talking about bias. Right? What about bias? And they said, we like to think that we give unbiased reporting. And a couple of things happened, it was a call-in show. So somebody called, and he was a Republican strategist. National Public Radio has a reputation for being kind of left-leaning. They don't think they're left-wing. Nobody ever thinks that they're biased. But this person called, and he says, I've always listened to NPR. And they said, but you're a Republican strategist, and you actually think that we're biased. And he said, oh, yeah, you're totally biased. You're left-leaning. They said, well, why do you listen to us? Because the information you give me is good. Because it's extremely high-quality information. Just as a sidebar, I know lots of people who would identify as progressive in the US who read the Wall Street Journal. Very conservative editorial line, but everybody recognizes that the information is good, that the reporting is good, that they're committed to facts. And we can talk about I could talk more about tips to discerning that. But there was another conversation that was very interesting to me, and I'll finish on this, because it had to do with the complexity of bias. So National Public Radio, first of all, it was a good sign that they were talking about bias. They had this program on bias. And they said, well, are we biased? And they said, one of the pieces of evidence that we used to suggest that we were not biased was the fact that over the course of time, we had been covering the conflicts in Israel and Palestine. And they'd noticed that sometimes they got lots of angry emails from Israelis and members of the Jewish community in the US. And other times, they got lots of angry email from people who were much more sympathetic to Palestinians. They said, so we're unbiased, right? So they actually contracted with a firm to look at their news coverage and to discern it for bias. And the news firm came back and said, no, your reporting has a clear bias. It's not pro-Palestinian, it's not pro-Israeli, it's pro-peace. We noticed that whenever there was a peace, any kind of opportunity for peace, you gave that far more coverage than you gave to conflict. So that's a bias, right? And I think that's a rather interesting way to think about bias, is to think about bias not as a right-left thing, but to think about what are the ethical commitments of the news sources we read, and to be very candid about those, and to say, these are the ethical commitments of this news source. I may or may not self-identify with those commitments. I know Brendan and I, we had a conversation at one point about how we sometimes choose news sources precisely because they're not, that we see them as challenging to our bias. And that's one question. But an even more fundamental question is, are they committed to factual reporting? And I want to just say that looking for an unbiased source is, I think, a red herring, because you're going to say if the source is unbiased, then it's truthful, which is not necessarily the case, because probably if you think it's unbiased, it's just because it shares your bias. Whereas truth is another question, whether they're committed to truth in their reporting.
I think this is a great point to pick up on. And I'll ask my next question to our journalists, our current and our former journalists, because I do agree with you, Reid, that, and I think part of what we want to do with this session is not just to admire the problem, but to really engage in some practical ways that all of us can become more informed, more open consumers of news. I hate that term, but consumers of news. You touched on what are the practical ways that we can do this, and as you said, Reid and I had a conversation where we say, I lean a little bit more to the right myself, and as much as it frustrates me sometimes, I will read the Toronto Star's version of the story every time. But to pick up on that point of differentiating between bias and fact-based reporting, that can be harder often than we give it credit for, because, at least in my own opinion, and Michael, maybe you can speak to this, sometimes bias is found in the structure of facts rather than the facts themselves. So as an example, I recall not even just a few weeks ago, the Premier of Ontario announced that we were going to sell booze in more locations than just the LCBO. And the Toronto Sun reported it pretty factually, as far as I could tell, in terms of, this is what's going to happen, this is how it's going to work. The Globe and Mail did the same thing. Then the Toronto Star threw in at the end of its story, there will likely be financial penalties for this due to a contract with the beer store. No one else had mentioned it, right? Which is a fact and is part of the important part of narrative to consider. But I guess, so practically, Michael, how should we separate, let's call it good bias, for lack of a better term, from fact-based reporting? And I know you're very passionate about this. How does a good journalist structure facts into their storytelling or story making?
I think the thing you have to see in the bias is not in the way any individual story is reported, but in what they consider a story and what they don't consider a story. At the Catholic Register, I've written a lot of stories about nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament. More stories than you'll see in, the Globe and Mail and the CBC and so on. I write about that quite regularly because that's something that we consider an important issue. We're all going to die in a hail of radiation and fire. that's not good. And we think that's news, that it's getting worse, right? There are more of these weapons, and they're getting more sophisticated, and we think that's news. Nobody else thinks that's news, I don't know. But that's our bias. Not that we report different facts about nuclear disarmament, but just that we report it. The easiest way to understand bias is to look at the sports pages. I'm a baseball fan. I follow the Blue Jays. Now, back when newsrooms were big, there was a guy in a daily newspaper who just followed that team, went on the road with them all the time, reported all that stuff. The story for him was the story of whether the Blue Jays succeeded or failed. That was the story. He didn't say that the Blue Jays were great when they were terrible. The bias wasn't cheerleading for the Blue Jays. It was just that the story was about the Blue Jays. If you read about the same game from the guy at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, it was the same game. The same score was reported, the same sequence of innings, scoring opportunities, and so on. But their story was about whether the Twins had succeeded or failed. Whether who was injured on the Twins team, all that kind of stuff, right? So if you're looking for bias, look for what is in the news budget. What is the story? What do they consider a story? What do they put on the front page? What do they put on page 17? Okay? So what's the bias in the Globe and Mail? Corporate Canada is news. The stock market is news. It'll make the front page more often than not. The economy is the way the government should be run. That's their bias. If you read the Toronto Star, the economy makes the news in different ways, right? How the stock market does. When I was a young reporter in Sudbury covering mining, we had the big October crash in 1985, 86. Remember that? No, you don't.
A polite moderator nodded. Yeah. Polite moderator.
87, yeah, that's right, 87. Up to that point, nobody had, small newspapers, the Sudbury Star didn't have stock pages, didn't report what the stock market was doing, because that was for a tiny little group of people who were investors. Now we use the stock market to measure how well the economy is doing and how well the country is doing. It's entirely false for all kinds of reasons, but we have that bias. It doesn't mean that the Globe and Mail's reporting about the stock market or about the economy is inaccurate. It's just that they consider the stock market more important than the Blue Jays. They've got full-time reporters dedicated to the stock market. Nobody goes on the road with the Blue Jays anymore. It's always AP stories now when they're on the road. So it's what's important, right? It's what you dedicate your resources to, okay? At the Catholic Register, what the Pope says is news. It's not news at the Globe and Mail. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm reporting it differently than the Globe and Mail would if they were reporting it. Okay? If you want to find news that's trustworthy, I'd say, look, first, don't trust any news service or any news outlet that never prints a correction. If you don't make mistakes, you're not actually doing this. I mean, if you never run a correction, are you infallible? if you run a correction, it means the truth matters to you. A few weeks ago, Hans Zollner, the guru on abuse in the church, was here in Toronto talking at Regis College. I wrote a story on it. He said something about a company that's based in Montreal called MindGeek, which is the largest online purveyor of porn in the world. And, but they also have offices in Luxembourg. And I thought he said something about them locating in Luxembourg for tax purposes. And it seemed, and I wrote this, and I was wrong. MindGeek does not locate in Luxembourg for tax purposes. It's because they want to be on the same time zone as, I don't know what. Anyway, so they got in touch with me, and we ran a correction. Even as terrible a people as MindGeek may be, being accurate and being right was important enough to us to run a correction. Right? We run corrections whenever we make a mistake. If I genuinely made a mistake, I'm not infallible. Nobody's infallible. So look for people who do corrections. Also look for people who talk to everybody who's legitimately involved in a story. When I do abortion stories, I speak to, abortion rights stories. I speak to the Abortion Rights League. I speak to academics who believe that denial of abortion is a human rights violation. I also speak to people, people in the church who have the opposite view. I'm covering the same issue in the same people. I don't limit the people I talk to just to the people who might agree with my readers, right? When I do euthanasia stories, I talk to Dying with Dignity. I have a very good relationship with Shanaz Gokul, the CEO of Dying with Dignity. And she talks to me because she knows that I will accurately report what she said. So anybody who keeps talking to the same people over and over again and never talks to the other people, don't trust them.
I want to. I think this is great because you're talking a little bit about the process a responsible journalist will go through to create a story rooted in facts. Yeah. I want to bring Mark in on this because once again, here comes the agenda with Steve Paikin, Nerd Boy. Well, the show is notorious.
I didn't consent to be calling a nerd boy.
Oh, I'm the nerd boy. No, I'm the nerd boy for Steve. No, let's be clear about that. So that show is notorious for, to your point, Michael, the presentation of radically different views given relatively equal time, and a conversation that's extraordinarily respectful and not, 10-second sound bites screaming at each other, right? And so I would love for the sake of our audience, most of whom I imagine are not journalists, to kind of give us a bit of a day in the life peek at how you and other journalists in that program, or in any other example of your time in journalism, how you would go about structuring a balanced story, and how do I phrase this? How do you ensure through process that you're engaging in fact-based reporting, very practically?
I guess to a certain extent, maybe the agenda with Steve Paikin is a bad example for how journalism actually gets structured and actually done in Canada, because I was incredibly blessed to be part of that program for the time that I was there. And the nice thing about it was we had, I was given a block of time that was generally 54 minutes to do something on something. And it was in the last probably about 6 years of my career there, I was trusted enough that it was like, okay, just go do what you want. And I typically had about a week to bring that together, and that's just a boggling amount of time for what happens typically in media these days. So, yeah, maybe I should sidestep how I did things there and just kind of talk about a bit of the difficulties in order of actually making this work effectively in like, an actual, like, news environment where you're chasing people. The biggest problem that you have right now in the Canadian media in terms of bringing together balanced stories is that you have people who aren't beat reporters anymore, because we don't have like beat as in you are on the politics beat. You're at City Hall and you're just going to follow City Hall all the time. You're going to be the stock market beat guy. You're going to be at the TSX and you're going to do that all the time. You can't do that anymore. There's not enough people to do that any longer. So you're just doing a little bit of everything. The thing that was great about having beat reporters, like if you're a religion beat reporter, was you just got to meet people over and over and over again and expand your network and go out and out and out. And you put out a story, and to be totally honest, your first story was probably not that great on an issue. You're probably missing a ton of stuff, and you didn't even know what you're missing. Like, it's kind of like one of these things when you're learning something, you don't know what you don't know. And then, you get an angry letter from somebody, and you're like, oh, well, that's a good point once I get past all the swearing and stuff like that about what you did. And then you go out and you go out and you go out from there. This would be the recommendation, if I could give to the people in the room who are concerned about bias in the media, is to remember that journalists are people just like you who go about their job with goodwill. They have a limited amount of time at work to do what they have to do in the day, and then they got to go home and take care of their family and do all the rest of that. They deeply care about what they're doing, but there's only so many hours in the day. So the other problem is there's only so much space that they have to put their story into. 800-word story to cover whatever. Make it work. And you got to get quotes in there from people who are probably speaking in circles and stuff like that. It's really hard. So by nature, you're going to miss stuff. Now, what you ought to do, in my opinion, if you are a person who is reading a paper or watching a newscast and you see something that you don't like, or you see an opinion that's missed, is remember that the journalist who brought that together is a person who's doing their best most of the time. And they're there. Like, the thing about journalists is that there's probably not a more kind of out there profession outside of politics and stuff like that. They have Twitter accounts, they have comment sections on their story. People know who they are, and if they do a bad job, people are going to tell them that they did a bad job, and that actually affects them. So there has been a series of recently really high-profile mess-ups in the media, and the media has, to varying degrees, tried to respond to those in the best will that they have possible. Let's think of the Rolling Stones. About 5 years ago, they put out the story on sexual assault on campus, which had a big factual problem in the main story that they hung the story together in. All the actual other facts and figures that were put together were actually correct. But the story that they hung the story on was not correct. The person who did that got sued for $2 million. They haven't published a story since that lawsuit came out, and the Columbia School of Journalism came in to review the entire thing, and they wrote an 80-page report on everything that went wrong in that process. I think things like that actually matter insofar as journalists have biases that come out of their own political opinions, out of their trying to get the job done within the space that they have and the time they have it. But a good publication is open to your feedback and your criticism, and the important thing is just to remember that coming at someone rationally and in terms of, hey, you missed something, maybe you forgot this, is probably a better way to actually get your story corrected and get information out there, opposed to what I think a lot of people do when they're responding to journalists, which is like thinking that this person has deliberately tried to spite them, if that helps.
I want to pick up on this let's call it sympathy for the journalist point. This idea that they're a shrinking profession, more pressures on them than that profession has felt in a long time, fewer people trying to do more work, fewer beat reporters, so to your point, less really thick engagement on one particular issue in one particular scene. Daniel, you work with journalists as part of your profession on a daily basis. So as an outsider who works so closely with them looking in, do you see that pressure, and how does it manifest itself in how stories are produced, or even, I guess, from the perspective of someone in PR? Do you find you can struggle to get across a truthful point to a journalist because they're overworked and that something's missed? Do you see that pressure in your daily work life?
Well, I've learned to admire journalists, and I've learned that we want their industry to operate extremely well for the benefit of democracy. You should see how many times at the office I tell my staff, I say, this is not, my parents are from Egypt. This is not Cairo, where the media, is controlled by Mubarak in the old days, or this is not Pinochet in Chile. This is Canada, where our clients need to say yes to interviews from Michaels and others. So what I see is that all around me, leaders, maybe church leaders like a bishop or an executive director of a charity, but certainly corporate executives, will sit there and pick and choose, like the old Mexican politics, el dedazo, pick and choose. You all take that interview, and you all take that question. And give me the questions beforehand. That's the worst thing on earth. Michael, you get that every day. Well, the pompous, regal client, in my case, sits there on a throne thinking they can just control this like if we're in some totalitarian regime. I can't believe this exists today every week for me. And that's why I say we need more people who are missionaries in this corporate culture that I don't recognize, and I frankly hate. I shouldn't say hate, I don't like. But it exists. So whether this selective filtering of who I'm speaking to and who I'm not has got to go. Who's going to change it? It's us, we the people. Poor journalists. I empathize with you guys.
I want to briefly go in a little bit of a different direction with you, Reid. You identified in the other beatitude that you contributed to our list, and I think it was a surprising point when you initially sent it, and so I want to touch on it. You talk about how we shouldn't exclusively rely on news sources whose native habitat is a screen. So whether that's TV, whether that's Facebook, we need to get away from just watching sources that come from a screen. Could you go into a little bit of detail about what the risk of doing that is?
So here I'm drawing a bit on the thought of Marshall Mcluhan, who was a media theorist who's associated with St. Mike's. For entirely other reasons, I happened to be reading some of his work, and he distinguished between what he called hot and cold media sources. Now, it's counterintuitive because television was a cold media source, and radio and print are hot media sources, which seems counterintuitive when you think of the screen as hot. Because what he meant had to do with the intensity of the information that can be communicated. That screens are very good at presenting episodic kind of information. Now, it doesn't mean there's never good content on a screen, the agenda. So there are things that are long form. But basically, the native habitat, I think of the native the thing that, sitcoms, the television is their native habitat. So to do something that's not a sitcom on a television screen is to do something different with that tool. Radio, we react to radio very differently than we react to screens. And radio tends to be much more amenable to kind of longer form reporting, where you get a longer story, as does print. Now, I emphasize native habitat because I access almost all my news. Not all, I still have some print publications. But even radio I often get in the form of a podcast. But I'm very conscious of the fact that the podcast I'm listening to, its native habitat is radio. And the thing that I'm looking at when I'm reading the New York Times on a screen, I'm saying the native habitat of this publication is print. Now, once it moves to the other habitat, it does get changed in some ways. I think in our conversation at some point, they talked about how CBC now has any news report, you can either look at the screen, like there's a kind of television little thing, or you can read the report. I think that so what's interesting about that is that many people are talking about how Twitter and Facebook have really changed news. Reading Mcluhan, I'm not convinced that they've changed news much more than television does. I think the mischief already came when we had television, because then we began to interact with the news in the mode of entertainment. The thing that was added, though, by Facebook, which I think is a bit destructive, and I'm starting to deactivate. So I just took Flipboard. Do you know Flipboard is a news source? I actually finally just took it off my device. Because the one thing that it does add was it adds this filtering of news. At least the television news, you got all the news from that night, right? All the news that they chose. At least when I listen to the CBC every morning, I get all the news, somewhere between 15 minutes and an hour of news, and I just get whatever they're giving me, right? Which I think is healthy. The problem that we have with Twitter, and less so, but then especially Facebook. Well, Twitter, if you go to latest, you're probably okay. But if you go to that self-selection mechanism, then you get into danger because, and Flipboard, I just found was too much like this. You're getting news that's tailored for you, which, to go back to Michael's initial point, is exactly what you don't want. You don't want news that's tailored for you. You want news that is not tailored for you, but is tailored for a broader public, because then you're participating in that broader public. So that's the only thing that's added. In terms of the news, I still think to say that I'm going to have some news source, and I know that this was originally in radio, and I know this was originally in print, that increases the likelihood that it's long-form, detailed reporting. And I think we need some of that. We also need headlines, but we also need some long-form, detailed reporting. And radio and print can do that in a way that any form of screen, at least anything that originates on a screen, cannot.
I have to ask you a follow-up question about this point, because I think this gets at, one of the challenges, the real challenge that makes this era of news consumption different. Raise your hand, people in the audience, raise your hand if you have ever heard a news story that you wanted to go deeper on, but for whatever reason, you didn't have the time. You were at work, you were too busy, you couldn't do it. Almost all of us. At my work, for a separate reason, I found a statistic that blew my mind. A university out of the United States, can't remember which one, and the French National Institute did a study, and they found that 6 out of 10 Facebook users will share a story after only reading the headline. After only reading the headline. So the majority of people will share a story without even actually reading it. So to come back to your point about the challenge of the native of the news sources whose native habitat is a screen, it plays to this very modern problem, which is too many of us just don't have a ton of time to devote to news and to participating in the information ecosystem as citizens. When I used to work in politics, there was this tropey line, which I've never seen a study to back it up, but I believe it, which is the average person every day only thinks about politics for approximately 4 seconds. And I believe it. I totally believe it. So I guess my follow-up question is, I agree with everything you're saying. We need to engage in more of the long-form stuff, because that's where you get that crunchy, interesting detail, right? But we're coming up against, it's like the, what's the phrase? The unstoppable force meets the immovable object, right? So I guess, is it possible to overcome that? How do we overcome that?
Can I just respond quickly to that? And then I actually think that Mark had some ideas around this headline clicking thing, right? So, but let me just be brief. So I don't think that that's entirely new, right? So when I read a print newspaper, when I was a kid, I didn't usually, when I was younger, I didn't, for me now, I'm 50 years old, so kid goes right up to 30. When I was a kid, I often didn't read newspapers because there was too much there. And I felt like, and when did I start reading newspapers a lot more? When I learned that I didn't read every paper in all of its detail, every article in all of its detail. Some I read in depth, some I read usually I don't just read headlines, but some I read the first paragraph, right? But I think that the distinction I'm making is to work with news sources that want me to read the whole story. I think the dangerous news sources are the news sources that don't care if I read the whole story. So I still may not be able to read the whole story, but I'm confronting a news source that wants to draw me in. And is doing the work and is supported by me in such a way that it can do the work to give me that deeper engagement if I want it. And I think that does make a difference. I think that even makes a difference in the crafting of headlines. I think a headline that's followed by a really deep, factually based, careful report, I think it's a better headline. It's not perfect, right? And papers have different headline conventions that reflect their bias. This is actually really well documented, that often of the other place, in terms of what's reported and what's not, and how do they headline things, right? So, but I just think you can tell a difference in a source that wants me to engage those, even if I can't. I think where we run into trouble is these news sources that don't want that at all. Yeah. So can I actually just unilaterally hand it to Mark? Because you had said something about this.
Yeah, you've been given the power. Yeah, so there's a bunch of things that I'd like to say off of that, so I'll just try to confine it. One of the things I think is important to keep in mind when it comes to this discussion about headlines and what you actually see and all the rest of this is to remember that so much of how people consume the news now, this kind of goes back to your 4 seconds point, is that people aren't really consciously tuning into the news in a lot of ways. So the way that they get the news, the way that people get the news distributed to them in the current ecosystem is through Facebook primarily and Twitter secondarily. Now, there's some things to consider when that happens now. Facebook has an algorithm that is designed to come up with the results that they want out of the system. So for a long time, you probably noticed that when you went on Facebook, if you have Facebook, when you went on the news feed, you had all your friends playing these dumb games like Farmville and stuff like that. And the idea behind that was Facebook at the time thought that they could get more time spent on screen by getting you to do monotonous tasks over and over and over again. The problem is then we had a problem with Cambridge Analytica where a bunch of people's personal data got stolen and Facebook is going to pay a huge fine as a result of that, and et cetera, et cetera. So Facebook is like, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. What we're going to do instead, and this is Sam Harris, who is probably not a great name to reference in this room. However, he's got a podcast that he did a couple months ago on his Waking Up podcast with, I think it's Roger McInerney. He wrote a book called Zucked. And so this guy, he was original advisor and investor in Facebook, and he basically got freaked out about it at a certain point and withdrew. And so he's written this book about how Facebook is killing democracy and all the rest of this stuff. And what he says in that interview, which I take his word on it, is that after Cambridge Analytica, what Facebook decided to do was to promote big reactions on Facebook. So this is about the time when it wasn't just a like, it was a wow, an angry, an heart, and all these sort of things. And the algorithm is now gamed, not necessarily even for you to click through. The algorithm on Facebook is designed for you to say angry, for you to say like, and you'll go through your newsfeed and you'll see it. The number of reactions that are not just the likes are creeping up. That has profound effects on how you see the people around you and how you consume your news. Because now it's not just that you're in your own little ecosystems, like they talked about before, that you're in your bubbles. It's that algorithm is actually gamed to make you angry. And that's a problem when we live in a civil society where we're supposed to see each other with goodwill. Because your neighbors aren't out to get you. It's just a thing that everybody is a good person who's trying to do their good thing. Now, when you go to Twitter, which is the next place where people get their news from now, the dirty little secret that came out from Pew recently, they had a study that came out, I think, 3 weeks ago. And basically, what they basically came out with that is that 80% of the content that gets posted on Twitter is coming from 10% of the users that are on there. We thought that Twitter was going to be this democratic commune where we're going to go out and there's going to be this rational kind of exchange of ideas. And what we've lost in that is that it's just a very small number of people who are actually engaging in that space. We've traded one elite for another there. And there's their own biases put in terms of what gets shared on Twitter, and it's much of the same trading on outrage kind of thing. Nuance does not do well on Twitter, which is a problem for civil discourse. So what do we do with that? One of the beatitudes that I put in this is that you shouldn't click a like on something on Facebook until you've actually read the article. Because unless you know what's actually in there, you're just feeding that beast. The other thing that I think that we need to consider is that people actually need to read newspapers, like a physical newspaper. I know it's old school, but we're Catholics, we're okay with old school. And I think that there's something to be gained from actually opening up a physical newspaper and going through and looking at things that you may not be interested in necessarily, but it's right there in your screen, in front of you, in your face. There are people who have curated information for you. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
One of the other beatitudes that you put down was also to blessed are those who remember that every person has dignity. And I kind of want to enter into that part of the conversation for a second. And I think it's a part of the conversation that it's really important for us as Catholics. You know, we're called upon to love our neighbor, to love our enemies, right? So to have an openness of heart. But, you know, even and I think I'm pretty aware of this stuff, I'll read a story, you know, or I'll see something on Twitter, or I'll see something on Facebook, and raise your hand if you've done this. I'm sure we all have. Where you read about someone, or you read, and you just think, I hate that person, you get angry, right? And I think that is becoming a lot of the default mode with which a lot of us engage in news now. A lot of anger and a lot of hatred, you know, even I think the best intended of all of us. And to the point that you're making, Facebook, Twitter kind of rewards those emotions. You know, if 10% of users on Twitter create 80% of the content, I'll tell you, when I go on my Twitter, that 10%, they are pissed. They are angry. And they say terrible things, right? And so I guess this is a question for the whole panel. How do we as Catholics engage as citizens, particularly with people that we radically disagree with, without falling into the trap of anger and hatred and sins?
I actually think that the way you get out of that kind of pathological set of emotional reactions to things you see on social media is that you step away from social media. You start talking about the things you've read, the things you've seen, with your wife, with your parents, with people you meet. Have conversations. One of the things I have to explain more and more to people that I'm interviewing, who are afraid of being interviewed, because people's image of a journalism interview is taken from 60 Minutes, and it's a confrontation with Mike Wallace who's going to destroy your life, right? Is that what it is, all I'm doing is I'm having a conversation with you. Journalism is built on conversations in order to feed a conversation. We're here for conversations, for the exchange. Nothing we do is all that permanent or all that. It's not the final word on anything. It is about what we have to do is to keep the conversation going. I was reading, when we started talking about doing this, I was reading my old textbook from when I was at NYU back in 1982. and it had a chapter on ethics. And of course, we're not very well respected in the world, so it really tried hard to make journalism ethics really important, and it quotes Greek philosophers and all that kind of stuff. What was really remarkable about it is that version of ethics from long before the internet and social media was that we were responsible for maintaining a certain level of conversation. We were the gatekeepers of the information that got to people. What Danny was talking about was how social media has changed that. Back when I started as a know-nothing reporter in Sudbury covering mining, if Inco wanted to get a message out to people or wanted to explain itself to people in Northern Ontario, they had to talk to me. They couldn't do it themselves. Now, whether it's a bishop or a CEO, they don't need me. They got their own web page, they got their own Facebook feed, they got their own Twitter feed, they got some 19-year-old running it all for them. Yeah, they're all 19. Yeah, and they would rather not talk to me. And they would rather not be included in a story that's going to also quote somebody else that they disagree with. And they would rather not have a conversation, which maybe I'm going to ask some ugly and impolite questions. If we can have conversations among ourselves with real people, then I think what you see on Twitter becomes less important. And the conversations become more important. I think that's where that goes.
Mark, how do we keep loving our neighbor amidst all this?
If I can give homework for tonight, a book that I would recommend is by a guy named John Ronson. That's John with no H, and Ronson, Ronson. He's the guy who wrote The Psychopath Test. He wrote the books that got turned into Men Who Stare at Goats and Frank. He wrote a great book about 6 years ago called So You've Been Publicly Shamed. And what he does in that book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, is he talks to a bunch of people who have been destroyed on the internet, just ripped apart. So, for instance, he talks to Justine Sacco, who is a woman who made a very poorly advised joke about AIDS on Twitter and then fell asleep on a plane on her way to Cape Town and woke up on the airport and in Cape Town. And so, like, one of those horror stories where you go to sleep and your world's crumbling around you and you don't know till you wake up. And so she landed, and it turned out that Gawker had taken her tweet that was sent out to 170 of her followers, and they blew it up on Twitter. And by the time she landed, she had lost her job. She'd been trending around the world on social media, and people were calling for her to be killed, and just all sorts of terrible stuff. There was a guy waiting at her gate when she got off the plane to take a picture of her, to shame her further. The thing that I take away from the book is that what John says is that he's a guy who spent his entire career as a nonfiction writer looking at how organizations and people with power had misused their power and hurt people who were small. And what has happened in the internet era is that we collectively have become powerful, but we refuse to acknowledge our power, and therefore we don't use it wisely. I think what John does in that book, which is really helpful for consuming the news, is he shows the real-life consequences of what happens to individual people when they get caught up in a firestorm of the media. I was going to use a different storm. And what I think is important to take away from that is there's actual real people who are getting covered in the news, and also the news has its biases, as we've talked about, and it makes mistakes. And so you can't assume that you know the full picture on anything when you're reading about something. So therefore, perhaps it's not actually worthwhile to jump on a bandwagon to go after a person or to assume that you know the full story about an issue based upon a single story. The news is important. The news that has its limitations. It doesn't do you any good to get furious about what you read in there and not trust your neighbors based upon it because you may not have the full story.
So the advice I have is to bring humanity or charitable Catholic virtue and values to social media. First thing is to get reacquainted with the act of listening. I really found, because I work with so many corporations who just want to talk and control ink or airtime, I realized, man, I've come to the conclusion that listening is the first act of charity or love that I can do every day. Anything I want to do in my Catholic life, step one, listen. Maybe prayer first or meditate on my own, get ready mentally, but then listen. So social media, we should be listening. Second thing is, I think intentionality on social media is important. For example, for me, I want to use social media as a ministry. So I want to be someone to tend, like Pope Francis says, the church is like a field hospital. Well, because there's so much hatred, because there's so much gossip, because there's so much rancor or backstabbing, that's a lot of breaches of the Ten Commandments, and lust and greed. Oh my goodness, all the Ten Commandments are being broken regularly on social media. Maybe we should be the ones to listen and lend a hand. So being ministers or having an apostolate for yourselves and myself on social media is a good idea. And then something I've learned from my own, in PR, you're supposed to be the bridge builder. I say to my staff, we're not the Supreme Court of Canada. And we're not the conscience of that person or that person or that person. Let them decide. We're bridge builders. We want a good debate from a journalist who's going to hit hard questions and a corporate leader who's going to have that conversation. We relish when that happens. Oh, when that doesn't happen, it's a travesty to democracy. So we want to build bridges in social media and go after the person who's depressed, the person who, if you see someone who's always angry or always anti-Semitic or anti-this, anti-that, maybe it's time to show them love. I think that's what we should do. And then I think that's about it. I mean, obviously, Bishop Barron often talks about educating people in argumentation, how to support your position with arguments. But that starts with listening and reading. So I think the last thing is to take more time. We got to take more time to properly consume news. So I guess it's just like eating. If I'm eating my dinner without peace and quiet, then that's not a good thing. So if you're consuming media while in the washroom, excuse me to be blunt, or while cooking your toast and it's obviously not burning, or someone's in front of you or two people are in front of you and you're consuming your media, you know what? I kind of want to take a little fish or little chicken doll and slap them in the face. In my family, I can do that gently. But, I mean, consume it properly when you have 15 minutes, not when you're on the run. And I know everybody consumes media on the run, but that's not a good idea.
Okay. So, yeah, I guess we're being recorded, so we want to use the microphone. I was going to say I've got a really loud voice, so I could probably just speak. But so one of the things that we talked about as we were preparing this was the possibility that we might introduce some news sources to y'all that you might not have heard of before. And so I'm actually going to do that, but in answer to the question, because one obvious answer, so I talked about bias, and I talked about bias as not necessarily being a bad thing, and biases being of different types. And so one way to preserve the dignity of human beings as we consume the news is to deliberately choose at least one news source that you access regularly that has a stated bias in favor of the dignity of all human beings. Right? So let me just suggest one that you could consider. Again, I'm not suggesting this is the only one, but I've been a reader for a long time of this news source called the Christian Science Monitor. Now, sometimes people freak out a little bit about the Christian Science Monitor because they're afraid of Christian Science. We could talk about Christian Science, but Christian Science is a complex Christian denomination, but one of their convictions is that we're freed through knowledge. And they said, well, we should found a really top-tier news service then. So they did. But the reason I'm suggesting that is, so Christian Science Monitor wins all kinds of awards, so it's really, really well reputed in the news world. It used to have a daily paper, and they were actually the first major U.S. newspaper to discontinue their daily print. So now the daily is entirely online, and they just do a weekly edition. So I have this weekly magazine that they produce, and then they also have news sources stories every day. But the reason I say that is because, so I've got the editorial here. This is the April 15th weekly edition. And in the editorial that's setting up the stories, they say, as they're setting up, so the editorial in this case is not their position on some political issue. This is the editorial that sets up the stories in the issue. They say, sometimes lost amid the controversy is the human picture of why these issues are so important. And they say this all the time. They say, what we want to give you is the human picture about why this is an important question. And then they often they do lots of interviews with people, often in communities. One section in this newspaper is in blue, so I should be able to find it, is a section called Points of Progress. So every one of these weekly editions has Points of Progress, a global roundup. So here we have a story about the United States and how binge drinking for teenagers is at a record low, evidently. Britain, British wildlife populations have seen a resurgence. India, new bridge in India will benefit millions. I have no idea what that means, but I'll read it later on my way home. Afghanistan, a wrestling club that was bombed by the Islamic State is back and stronger than ever. Kenya, farmers are prospering by growing a native money tree. And then from Uganda, bees, and this is a longer article, bees fend off elephant invaders. So one of their editorial principles is that they always print what they call credibly hopeful stories. Credibly hopeful stories. Not just hopeful, but credibly hopeful. Stories that have some basis in fact. They're almost always local like that. You know, some particular, oftentimes some community initiative. In the weekly edition, they also have a section that's always people making a difference, and they profile a person who's made a difference in their community. You can write in and nominate people. It's not all, I mean, they cover all the news sources that everybody covers. Some of those news stories that they cover, because of the world that we live in, are very, very dark, right? But they're always looking for the impact on human beings. So I'm promoting the source. It's not the only one like that, right? But just to suggest that there are sources out there that say, we're biased. We're biased towards human beings and their stories. All human beings and all their stories. Do they make mistakes? They issue retractions, right? Almost, especially when you get the weekly edition, because it's usually already been on the online edition. They almost always have the retraction in the thing. They say, in an earlier version of this, we said this. That's not correct. But just to say that this is an example, they're out there, right? Sources that say, this is what we want to do. And one strategy, again, this isn't the only news source I read. I read multiple. I mean, that's another way to fact check, is to read multiple news sources. But it's to say, I'm going to choose with my biases, that bias not being right or left, that bias being human.
Matthew, how are we doing on time?
Well, probably one more question. I think we should ask for a few more questions. I was actually kind of hoping that maybe the panelists would share their 1 or 2 or 3 preferred news sources.
Sure. So why don't we do that?
In Toronto in 2019.
So why don't we do that? We'll get each of the panelists to give their 2 or 3, their mix of how they consume news, and then we'll throw to the audience for some questions, and then we'll wrap up. So why don't you start, Michael?
News sources. I change news sources all the time. I, fall in love with one and then fall out of love with it. One that might surprise you that I follow pretty regularly. Just went all digital. I had a magazine subscription. Is the American Jewish publication Forward. It has a wonderful history. It's an excellent publication. It's very American, but, you know, I also read The Guardian very regularly. Because it actually a lot of what I read about The Guardian is its coverage of Brazil. I'm working on a series of features that will run just before the Synod on the Amazon, and I was in the Amazon back in February for this, and they have excellent coverage of Brazil. My wife's Brazilian too, so I have to keep up on Brazil. What's another one? One thing I do too much of is reading international sources and ignoring my own. Know where you are, right? Know about your own community. Nobody, you know, even back when I was working for the Guelph Mercury, right? We went into 70% of households. We thought, that's terrible. 30% of people don't read us. And back then we thought, well, we need to give them more news about City Hall. We need to give them more local news. What we found out was that they didn't want it. They didn't care. People were disengaging already before social media, disengaging with their local lives, their real lives. They preferred a fantasy life of other people's problems in other parts of the world. So if you can read your local newspaper, I think that's also a good thing.
Nothing surprising for me, but I'll just name two sources that I think do things that you should look for in other sources. Editorially, I don't always agree with it, but I'm a subscriber to the Toronto Star. I subscribe to them because I think they have the most robust actual news coverage in the GTA. I've subscribed to the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and now I'm with the Star because I think they produce the most actual hard news right now. And that's what I appreciate over opinion. In terms of another one that I think is something you should look for in a good news source, and I think this is a good example of it, is The Economist. I personally love The Economist because even though it has its biases, I like that it talks about its stories and its biases through facts. So it's much more, I find, in my opinion, like hard information driving to the point that they want to get to, which I appreciate. I also appreciate that it's able to do things very quickly in terms of the sort of content it comes out at that's still at a high quality. So, you know, those are two kind of examples of sources that I think you should look at, but I personally look at so much that I don't even know.
I wish I could be clear in my recommendation, but I'm going through a tough time of lack of time and consuming news. And I've got to read all these news sources or magazines for clients, like Pizza Magazine or Food Service and Hospitality, or, and my own PR journals, which I do read. But I like reading. I really started to enjoy, I love observing humans. Like, so I really like... If I'm curious about, my wife is of Colombian origin, so I was interested in learning about what's going on in Colombia. So I would make a point to read a perspective of what's going on in Colombia, the army, paramilitaries versus insurgents. I like reading what the other, someone who thinks differently, other worldviews is thinking. So in the US, for example, I have a dad he's retired, he's 86, he's not very well, and all he watches is Fox News. So I go to Montreal and I hang out with my dad and I get Hannity or I don't know, these people. But I enjoy those because for me it's like little mini anthropology, I don't know, learning about other people's behaviors, and I just sit. And then at an airport I see CNN or I see CBC and I get that. At the office I tend to ask people questions, different points of view, and then ask them what's going on in the news. And so I find that I'm looking for two sides of the stories. So to use left and right in the US, I like looking at different perspectives. So in the church, I look at Salt and Light, I look at EWTN, I like the Catholic Register. I love Prayer Life, so Radio Maria Canada, I'm plugging them because it's the month of Mary. And Radio Maria has Vatican News, different things like that. and I did. You stole. Well, not stole. You mentioned NPR. I like NPR, and because I have clients in South Florida and my wife is from South Florida, I listen to WLRN's NPR in Miami, and I love it. So I think I also like reading Canadian Press, Associated Press. I really like those wire services, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are sending the news on majority of countries or majority of topics where they have, some person, a stringer or a free, bureau chief speaking about it. So I think it's a lot of a mishmash right now. So I don't have one regular go-to. It changes.
Thank you. So it just occurred to me, as we were talking about mishmash, I'll suggest an unexpected app. So if you haven't heard of it, you should look up Funnel, Funnel, which is an app, which is, you mentioned NPR, it's actually an app that you can choose the hourly updates from a variety of different news sources. So you can get the BBC, you can get NPR, you can get Voice of America, you can get a whole bunch of English language. I think Fox is in there. But they're just the hourly news update that you would get, which is nice because you can listen to, in terms of discerning bias, you can listen to two of them back to back. They almost always have the same stories, but they're shaded differently. And so in terms of quick news sources, I really like that. I don't get any news by television. I actually support TVO because I support the agenda, but I never watch it. Because I just don't think I think TV is a bad medium for news, so I don't get any news from television. When I'm at home, my mom watches MSNBC, so she cancels out your dad. Yeah. So then I watch.
Hang out with your mom.
Yeah. So I listen to podcasts. So I listen to The Economist. The Intelligence is a podcast they do every morning. I listen to Atlantic Radio, which is quite good. I never read The Atlantic. I only listen to the radio. And some other source that I'm forgetting now. I read the Christian Science Monitor and the Globe and Mail. In terms of Catholic news sources, America Magazine, the Register, I get in print, and then Crux News and the National Catholic Reporter, and I try to always read them together. There's actually some incest there as well, but they also have different perspectives, and they criticize each other a lot. National Catholic Reporter is a good example. So I subscribed to the National Catholic Reporter when I was a child, right, before I was 30. And I stopped subscribing because I read it for about 2 months, and then I decided that I'd read every story they were ever going to write. And so I canceled my subscription. And they've become much more interesting since then. At some point, they had an editor who was like, I think probably experienced what I did, and said, this is not just irresponsible, it's boring. Right? So they're no longer boring. They actually have opinion writers who actually attack each other, which is interesting. But so I think that's it. Yeah.
Just to wrap up this point, one of the Beatitudes, I can't remember who did it, but was to thou shalt not, blessed are those who keep up their newspaper subscription. So I want to plug that point really quickly. You can read 4 or 5 different news sources of different ideological positions, pay for at least one of them. Paying for a newspaper has never been cheaper. These poor people are dying for someone to buy a subscription. I think I saw it even 2 days ago. The Globe and Mail was running a special, like $2 a month for the first 6 months. We sit there and we get frustrated with journalism so often. We emotionally react, and then they break a story, and we all sit there and think, I'm really happy someone investigated that. I'm really happy I know that. Our democracy is better for that. So on that note, I'm a big fan of the phrase, to save one life is to save mankind. In that spirit, if even one member of this audience walks away from this panel and approaches news differently and approaches our democracy differently, takes their citizenship more seriously, I think we've succeeded. So I want to thank these gentlemen so much for speaking to us. If we can give them a round of applause. Wonderful insights. So in terms of questions, as you'll see, this mic it's not going far. So raise your hand and just say your question. If I need to repeat it back, I will, and we'll go from there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, a comment and looking for some feedback. You started off today's or this evening's discussion, and you were talking about distrust of the media. right? And you mentioned, about them making mistakes. So I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my friends. We don't think that's the #1 reason for distrust of the media, right? And it's further, Mark, as you mentioned the point that most reporters really try and present the true story. And I would disagree vehemently with that, right? Most reporters nowadays will present a story as if it's their side of a debate. And they will only present the facts that support their agenda in a discussion. So as an example, let's say a government has a 1% decline in employment. And they'll produce that and publish that. And you say, well, and they may even add the second part is they also add in their opinion. As if every article is an editorial. When most of us, all we want is the facts, all the facts, and let us make our own opinion, not interested in your opinion. So in the case of this situation, a reporter will look at that and say, okay, the government has a 1% decline in unemployment. And says, oh, what a great job they're doing. And then that'll be it. And you'll read that article and say, yeah, I agree, the government's doing a great job. But then you find out, if you read another publication, perhaps someone presenting a different side of the story will then say, oh yes, there was a 1% reduction in employment. But most of that is due to seasonal employment, part-time jobs, and low-paying jobs in the food industry. So therefore, 90% of it was that. That 1% reduction isn't all that great. And the person who wrote the first article had all that information, but won't present all of it because that's not what's important to their newspaper, because they maybe support the government that's currently in power. And because of that, that's what leads to a lot of distrust. Right? You're not presenting all the facts, and it's hard to find that these days. So I don't know if I was naive when, as you mentioned earlier, when we were kids up till 30, when I would watch Walter Cronkite, and I believed every word that came out of his mouth, because I didn't think he had a bias. He presented the facts and let the viewer make their own opinion. And it's hard to find that, whether it's left or right, religious, secular. You can't find that. All of them have an, sorry, I sense all of them have an agenda. Your thoughts on that?
Anyone want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think that you're touching on what a lot of people think about the media, and I think that this is one of the biggest challenges that we have at this moment. I'm not part of the media anymore, so I can just kind of say whatever I want. I could say, yes, you want to know what? The government comes down and tells us exactly what to think, which when I worked at TVO, a lot of people thought that. A lot of people thought that the premier came to our news tables and told us what we were going to run. It's obviously not true. I guess the thing is, what I would recommend is having a really robust number of news sources to read from, which is what I take you're saying already was what you're doing. You're going to a number of places to try to get as much information as you can. The challenge with the media, as I said before, is that they only have so much space to put things out. And so therefore, a lot of things get cut as a result of it. Things that get cut do get cut based upon people's biases. That is 100% true. Is that worse today than it was in the past? I don't know. Because when newspapers were originally founded, a lot of them were just funded by political parties. They give you lists on who to vote for. Journalists used to drink with politicians. Like, you know, there was actual bankrolling of journalists because journalists made no money. What we have now is that we have a situation where journalists actually make quasi-middle-class incomes, depending on who you are. You know, there is more independence there in order to say what you want. There's also, I think, a conception that if you're owned by Post Media, for instance, that whoever's running Post Media now, who's replaced? I don't know. That says something right there. The marching orders don't come from that person. Now, the flip side of all of this is there a bias problem in media, in journalism? Yes, there absolutely is. What's the political leaning of the aggregate journalist? It's left of the political spectrum. What's the political leaning of a professor in an average university campus? What's the political leaning of a police officer? What's the political leaning of a small business owner? Part of the problem that we have here is that we've kind of polarized off into a whole bunch of different communities, and we're having problems having discussions with each other. Is that anything new? I'm not really sure. I think the challenge that we have right now is that because there are the options to go elsewhere and consume your media from elsewhere, it gives people a chance to opt out of other people's narratives. And so as much as I can understand where you're coming from in terms of being frustrated with, and I agree with you, there's way too much news that's actually opinion, and it should be labeled as opinion when they put out there, and that's being done because of budget cutbacks and clickbait to try to keep the papers going. I'd ask you to keep reading it. And I'd ask you to write letters to the editor to explain your opinion on how you think that they have failed and engage in that dialogue. Because the only way that this gets better is if people who are of goodwill actually try to contribute to making the final product better. I don't know if that helps at all, because this is a huge problem. And I'd come down and I don't know if I agree with you or if I don't agree with you is basically what I'm coming to here.
Like from my standpoint, the argument, it's gotten so bad in a recent article a few months ago, and that's when I started to stop reading some of the newspapers. And to me, and how ridiculous it got. And you talked earlier about the Blue Jays. So this was a sports article on the Leafs. And they said the Leafs played really poor last night. They had a poor game plan, just like Trump's policies. And I'm thinking, I'm reading the sports section. I'm expecting sports analysis, and this guy's giving me an opinion on a country he doesn't even live in. Right?
Was there a picture at the top of that column of the writer?
Yes.
Yeah, so you weren't reading a news story. You were reading a columnist who's paid to give you his opinion. Okay? You must make that distinction between
So you think that was an editorial?
News, and there's a difference between columnists and news reporting. Okay? Now, I know of no news reporter who writes that a government has done a good thing or a government has done a bad thing. A news reporter may ask that question of people who might be presumed to know. The question and the subject of the interview, the person interviewed, those things may reveal bias. But that's not a news story if it's telling you what to think about the facts. That's a column. A good consumer of news should know the difference.
But like, just quickly, but Mark's point, I think, is that one of the points I think is that that's becoming less and less clear.
I think people have lost, because when it was a newspaper, people understood.
Exactly.
There was a picture at the top of that, the guy's name, that was a column. There's no picture, maybe even no name at the top of the story, that's a news story. It was visually clear, people understood it. Now we're putting the pictures of reporters
Exactly.
at the bottom of the, so
Yeah.
the cues are
Yeah.
confused,
Yeah.
people are having more trouble understanding what's the difference between an editorial, the position of the newspaper, and a columnist, the position of that individual, and a reporter.
And I think further to that point, both of those roles are now being played by the same people. You know, I mean, you know, I was always struck when I worked in Ottawa. You know, you'd watch Power and Politics every night, and there's Rosemary Barton engaging in an opinion show, and not to pick on Rosemary Barton if she's watching, but she's not. Going back and forth, you know, giving her opinion, and then you'd see her on the National 4 hours later giving an objective news report about a story. And so, to your point, it is often a question of personalities, right? Well, when I listen to Rosemary Barton, am I listening to Rosemary with her reporter hat on, or am I listening to Rosemary with her opinion, you know, moderator hat on?
We had a young intern at the Catholic Register, must have been a couple of years ago. And she told me that her professors told her that she has to build her brand, that she has to have a Facebook profile and a Twitter profile to build her personal brand. When I started in this business, you didn't get a byline unless the editor gave you the byline. You wrote stuff that didn't have your name on it. Now everybody's name is always there on the tongue. And I talk to Catholic Register readers who say, who you know, assume that what I'm presenting is my point of view. Often I disagree with the things I'm writing. But, you know, I'm a journalist, going back to my journalism and ethics textbook, journalists work for the reader. I don't work, the Archbishop of Toronto happens to own all the stock in the Catholic Register. He has every one of 600,000 shares in the Catholic Register. Okay? And somebody else is my boss and actually signs the check. I don't work for any of those people. I work for the reader. Just like your doctor works for you and your lawyer works for you. I work for a community of readers. I don't work for that reader or that reader, but that community. And that's my ethical obligation.
I do want to get other people. I want to get a question from other people.
Yes. To serve that community, and I can't do that if I am both a personality and a kind of laborer in the field.
And just one more thing, if I can just throw this in here. The other thing that has happened as a result of budget cutbacks and things like that is the problem in newsrooms is kind of the adults have kind of left the room to a certain extent. So I know friends who got laid off from jobs, and to find people my age, there's no work for them anymore at the salaries they want. There are jobs out there for people who are going to make minimum wage at entry-level job positions, and then there's jobs for executives. There's not jobs for editors anymore. And so, you know, the Trump example that you put in the hockey column, my first reaction, not knowing it, I think that someone should have flagged that and said, what the heck are you doing here? But the problem is, editors are expensive, and you can crank out content, slap it together, and probably people are going to click on it regardless. And this kind of goes back to my cheapest expensive comment. We stopped paying for this stuff because we stopped thinking it was worthwhile, and as a result, we have lesser quality because of it. We can't pay people enough the money to mentor others in how to do this properly.
Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for this. It's been very enlightening. And I'm wondering, okay, let's just take two examples. So you have Omar Khayyam. There's photos of him online with human body parts and holding them. There's footage of him making bombs. And he reportedly bragged with the greatest thing he ever did as an American soldier. And these his children, he had a dad and his wife or whatever. And on Easter Sunday, there was a show that introduced him with very happy music, and he was made out to be something of a hero. And it seems so skewed that he said, I win this on behalf of, I take this money on behalf of all Canadians. Something seems wrong in the state of Denmark with such a lopsided point of view. Or you could have the burning of Notre Dame. According to where I've heard, it doesn't mean this is right, people were saying it was an accident while it was on fire. Other sources are saying the fire was set in two places, yet the narrative remains this was an accident, notwithstanding the fact churches have been burned in France, a lot the past year or two. Something's definitely wrong in the state of Denmark. There's a talk of bridge building being the gatekeepers of info, and maybe that not being as much the case now. Keeping conversations going. What if people aren't being told what they need to know, or they're not being allowed to have alternate viewpoints being expressed? Is there any kind of Hippocratic oath to journalism that wasn't mentioned, that maybe is lacking? I heard Ted Koppel say it's bringing comfort to those who lack comfort. I've heard people say just telling the truth. I'm wondering if you could speak to how well the media is really telling the truth. That maybe it's costuming the truth in a way where it says it's presenting new facts, and that's all it's doing, but maybe with Notre Dame and with Omer Khadr, it's providing a costume that is painting the past in a way that's not allowing people to really see things clearly. So I guess to simplify this, to distill this, I'm wondering, is there a Hippocratic oath in journalism? What is it? And how well can the media do that? How well is the media doing that?
I know that I've read the ethics of journalists in the US and the Canadian Association of Journalists, and it includes accuracy, fairness, transparency, diversity, accountability. It's all online. Very noble, lofty goals, but I'm sure it's not adhered to all the time, just like in PR. But you know what? I want to say something, Michael, if you don't mind, I'll speak about our relationship. In questions of the Middle East, Michael and I don't agree, right? Think of Henri Boulad. I was working with a Jesuit elderly man from Alexandria, Egypt, that my parents knew, and I think he's my mentor in French. And he reported on him, and we disagreed a little bit. But you did some good reporting, and I challenged him on it, and he didn't retract because he didn't make a mistake. He cornered the elderly priest, and the elderly priest is one of those who believes that large powers are behind conflict in Syria, that there's major money involved in problems in the Middle East between protecting Christians and funding, and arms deals and NATO, and some people might say this priest is a nut, and he's not even welcome in France by the bishops because of his beliefs. But I don't think we're being told the truth all the time. I think that there's a lot of shenanigans going on because I see it in corporate Canada. I see money. Michael, you can challenge me if you want, but I see so much garbage in companies that sell ice cream and pizza and also tobacco and breweries. That do I think there's shenanigans in media like News Corp, Viacom, ABC, Disney, big time. Me personally, I'll share something personal with you. Disney is persona non grata in my home, and that's new for me. I don't want to watch Disney come into Disney movies. They'll be filtered before they're projected to my kids 5 times over. Other sources, I've worked with MTV and music. I've worked in PR so much that I go home and I cringe when I consume popular culture because of those big corporations behind it who sell vice, who sell promiscuity, who gain when you and me are broken. Because when you and me are broken, if I think I have a hairy back, which I do, if I think I need to buy Veet, V-E-E-T, depilation, because a hairy back is a weird thing in society, that's what companies want. I've been in brainstorms and meetings where people are talking about how can we make sex more fun? How can we make the man who has a hairy back feel weird? How can we make the girl who has this feel insecure? So there's a lot of garbage out there. So how does that impact government? How does that impact arms dealing? I'm only talking to you about beer, smokes, condoms. This happens. Of course, the same things happen in arms and in pipelines and in serious infrastructure. So, sorry, call me a conspiracy theorist, but there's tons of garbage out there, and we need militants who, by militants I mean someone who is an engaged citizen, like Cesar Chavez was in California, asking for union reform. We need advocates to say, yes, we can make change. Yes, go against dole. Yes, go against big institutions and affect change. And that's little David against big Goliath.
I'll take a kick at that. I think the thing to remember in the question that you're getting at here is that the journalism ethics that we have had up until recently are actually a fairly new creation. The first journalism schools in the US weren't actually open until 1905. The first ones were opening up. Before that, you had a period where there was mass disruption in how media was actually put out to people with the creation of the printing press. You had the rise of yellow journalism. You had a bunch of poor, bad information and media that went out to people. And what happened over time is we started to come up with better ways of presenting that information. Better ways of presenting that information that was both appealing to the public but also factually based. And we built up all these norms and these conventions that helped us do that. The thing that's happened in the last, pick how many ever years you want, is those conventions have become stressed as media has changed. You talk about Notre Dame and people speculating about, how many fires were set and things like that. That is a problem that's created by a 24-hour news cycle that we're still trying to figure out how do we actually present credible, factual information right away for people. That's really challenging to figure out, okay, right now Notre Dame's on fire. What do you know about it? Probably you could fill in 2 paragraphs if you're lucky. But you're going to have to just also start finding information on it. You're going to have to start finding people who can talk about it credibly. The building's on fire. You just can't have a helicopter showing the building on fire. You got to put in some information on top of that. We still haven't got good at figuring that out. The other thing that's kind of happened is with the rise of the of social media and things like that, free information going out there and things like that. We now need to, and people not wanting to pay for the news. There's now this stress to figure out how do we actually get information, how do we get eyeballs information that on a way that's responsible. So the media spends a lot of time, in my opinion, covering stories that are only covered because they think it's going to get them clicks. That's not a good thing, but those clicks are the only way they get their revenues. What's hopefully going to happen as a result of this entire process of us having a lot of bad free media, news media out there, is that the cream will rise to the top and we'll figure out again, like how we did when we had, the printing press came in and journalism schools opened up. We'll find ways to actually create media that is appealing to the public but also factual. We're not there yet, to be totally honest, and we got to try to figure that out.
When Brendan began, he talked about distrust of institutions, right? And the media is only one of those institutions. So I don't have any inside information on either Notre Dame or Omar Khadr. But the question of what started the fire at Notre Dame isn't a media question. It's a fire inspector question, right? So do we trust the fire inspector of Paris to determine the origin of a fire? Right? It's a different institution. And so the only media question there, it seems to me, is are they citing the fire inspector who's authorized to make these investigations? Now, could that person be wrong? Again, it's not just media people who are fallible. Everyone's fallible. But it seems to me that if there's a lot of media speculation of whatever kind that's not based on a report by a fire inspector, then that's questionable. But that's a different institution. And so the question is, what's our faith in that institution? Yeah.
I think maybe last question.
Last question? Sure. Go ahead. Yes.
My question, I really enjoy this topic, it's very fascinating. My question is, it's not so much about the facts. I do think that we have a responsibility as consumers to read as much as possible a diversity of news sources. My problem is more to get the completeness of the news is almost impossible. So it's almost like all news sources go and report some news, but all the gory stuff is still out there. When the gory stuff started to die down, I think that's part of what you're saying, the clicks is going to go down when they stop reporting it. So we never quite know, as a consumer, what happened in the end. And I think what happened in the end is quite important for us to decide what to do with it. So I just wonder what you can say about this.
No, that's
Think of information and think of news as two different things, okay? There's a huge ocean of information. News is a small stream within that ocean, okay? So if you want to know about the Cathedral of Notre Dame, there are books about architecture, about medieval society in Europe, about the development of Christianity in the West. Read those books. You'll learn much more about Notre Dame that won't be in the news stories. The news stories are about what happened to this thing, right? So I think people need to pay attention to the news, because if they don't, I won't pay my mortgage. But they also need to have other ways of understanding the world, you know? And I think the first way you should understand your world is to talk to the people around you. Just, not that they know anything particularly, more than you, but the more people you know, the more connected you are to the world. Communion is a great thing. And then, yeah, read books, watch movies, go to plays. My wife and I went to a great play last night. You know, there's a whole other set of things that will make the world more understandable and will situate you in the world. If it's just news, that's too narrow to situate you in the world.
Once again, sorry, Reid. No, never mind. Go ahead.
So I actually did want to affirm the difficulty, right? That there's always something new happening. But I just wanted to sort of add, so if news headlines are over here and great literature is over here, I just wanted to flag that there's stuff in the middle, right? So I think that inevitably we end up following particular questions. We have particular issues that we're following, right? But I think that this is where like there's a really important place for magazines that are commentary magazines that aren't primarily news, although they sometimes will do reporting, but they're mainly reflection on the news. So I mean, in terms of a secular magazine, something like The Atlantic or Commonweal in the Catholic world, but things like that, I think are useful, like monthlies. I guess we're talking about monthlies. Monthlies are useful precisely to sort of say, okay, a month of headlines have happened. What's floated to the top in a slightly longer time frame? The Economist actually does a year in review issue, which I think, and again, I think that so in between, I agree with everything that Michael said, but I think in between the kind of, this is what happened today, and the, Dostoevsky, we do have other news sources, commentary sources that try to be reflective and try to say, okay, all of these political scandals happened this year. Is there a pattern? Or all of these political victories happened this year? Or the economy, right? But again, do they fail? And those are commentary, right? So they're actually not news. Typically they're commentary, although they may do some reporting. Their opinion, but they're often opinion directed at taking a reflective view of a month or a year. And I think those are useful.
I've said it once already, but I'll say it again. A huge thank you to our panel for all of their insights and all the knowledge and expertise. That I saw someone try to applaud. Go ahead, we can do that. Yeah. I also want to thank all of you. And I know it's the perennial role of one of the event organizers to thank audience members. But I want to take the thank you a step further. Everyone here came for a different reason. Maybe you were curious about the topic. Maybe one of the panelists really interests you. But fundamentally, the shared thread of why you're all here is a concern for your citizenship, right? And a concern for the state of our democracy. I would say to you, take that seed and grow it. Because if every single Canadian did what you do tonight, your small act of citizenship, a lot of these problems that we're struggling with as democracies, not just here in Canada, but around the world, we'd go a long way to fixing them. And we need more Catholics involved in public conversations, involved in public life. We often talk about in our church, there aren't enough Catholics in the pews. I'll take that a step further. There aren't enough Catholics running for public office. There aren't enough Catholics voting. There aren't enough Catholics reporting news. And you don't have to do it for your full-time job. There aren't enough Catholics volunteering, right? Participating in events like these and institutions that support our democracy. If you're interested in taking this seed of citizenship and taking it a step further, please speak to Matthew in the back. Sign up to Catholic Conscience. We do events like these, but we also help educate people in Catholic social teaching and help connect them with volunteer opportunities, get them out into the community to serve the people that Jesus served, which is all of us, right? So I highly encourage you to do that. If you don't do that, I invite you, of course, to come to our May 30th event. This is not the end of the conversation, and we'll be doing more stuff in the lead up to the federal election and more stuff after the federal election. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Here, sorry, May 30th here at 6:30, Matthew? 6:30. Like I said, we'll have representatives from all the parties. If you're not curious, if you want to join a party, if you're curious about the parties, if you want to get involved in the election, great event to come to. So thank you once again. Have a great night, and I hope we'll see you all soon.